The night Daniel Hale threw his wife onto the street, he believed he was ending a problem, not starting a war. He stood inside the warm glow of their penthouse, watching the door close behind her, with the satisfaction of a man who thought consequences only happened to other people. In his mind, she was disposable, replaceable. A woman without leverage, without family, without a name that mattered. He believed silence meant defeat. He believed the rain would erase her. He was wrong in a way that would soon paralyze an entire courtroom and permanently rewrite his fate. Mara didn't scream when the door shut. She didn't pound the wood or beg for mercy. She stood there for a full second, letting the cold soak through her coat, letting the city decide whether it would swallow her or witness her. The doorman looked away, not out of cruelty, but because men like Daniel trained the world to look away. The street smelled like wet concrete and exhaust. Somewhere above her, Daniel was already pouring a drink, already rehearsing the story he would tell about the ungrateful woman who had tried to take what wasn't hers. 3 hours earlier, he had smiled while handing her divorce papers across a marble counter. He told her she had nothing to fear if she had nothing to hide. He said it casually, like a man commenting on the weather. He reminded her of the agreement she signed years ago, the one she barely read because she trusted him. Less than 5 years of marriage, no shared assets, walk away with what you brought in. He enjoyed that line. He repeated it twice, savoring the way it made her shoulders tense. He told her to leave quietly. He said it would be better for her image. He said the press could be cruel. What he didn't say was that his lawyers were already feeding them. By the time she reached the street, her phone was dead, her cards frozen, her access revoked with surgical precision. Daniel liked control. He liked watching systems obey him. He assumed she would fold. He assumed she would disappear. Mara walked instead, past storefronts that reflected her face back at her like a stranger's, past couples huddled under umbrellas, past the life she had built around a man who never bothered to learn who she really was. Each step stripped something away until all that remained was clarity. When she reached the bus shelter, she sat, shivering, and waited. Not for help, for the moment when fear finished burning and resolve took its place. She reached into the lining of her coat and removed a phone Daniel had never seen. It was small, outdated, and fully charged. She had kept it for years without knowing exactly why, only that some instincts didn't ask permission. She dialed a number she hadn't used since before she met him. When the voice answered, there was no greeting, no questions, only recognition. "I'm ready," she said. That was all. By morning, Daniel Hale's version of events was already circulating. Anonymous sources described a short marriage, a costly mistake, a woman who exaggerated her role and misunderstood her place. The narrative was clean, efficient, designed to make people stop caring. Daniel watched the headlines over coffee, satisfied. He believed the worst was over. He believed the storm had passed. He didn't know that while he slept, Mara was sitting in a quiet room with people who did not raise their voices because they had thrown her onto the street believing she would vanish. Instead, he had delivered her to the moment that would expose him completely. And as the court absorbed the truth of who stood before them, Daniel finally understood what it meant to mistake quiet for weakness. He understood that the street had not taken her, it had forged her, and now there would be no shelter from what was coming next. Daniel Hale spent the recess pacing the hallway outside the courtroom, pretending confidence while something acidic crept up his spine. He told himself this was theater, a bluff, a melodrama designed to scare a settlement out of him. He had seen it before. People overplayed their hands when they felt cornered. Mara had always been emotional. Quiet, yes, but emotional. He convinced himself this was just another performance, another attempt to feel important in a world that had finally corrected its mistake of elevating her. Inside the courtroom, the murmurs grew louder. Phones vibrated. Messages flew between reporters and editors who suddenly realized this divorce was no longer filler content. Names carried weight, and the one she had spoken carried centuries of it. Daniel's lawyer returned, face stiff, eyes no longer meeting his client's. Daniel asked what was happening. The lawyer said nothing at first, then asked a question Daniel hadn't expected. "Did you ever ask her about her family?" Daniel scoffed. "Of course not. That was the point. She didn't have one." Or so he thought. When court resumed, the judge's demeanor had changed. The casual impatience was gone, replaced by something closer to caution. He asked Mara to proceed. She didn't rush. She explained slowly, methodically, the way someone does when they know every word will be recorded, dissected, remembered. She spoke of trusts and holdings, of dormant entities and silent partnerships. She spoke of wealth that moved invisibly, not through flashy transactions but through quiet influence. Daniel tried to interrupt. He was warned. Once, he fell silent. The first document was entered into evidence, then the second, then the third. Each one landed like a measured blow. The prenup Daniel loved so much appeared on the screen, highlighted clauses suddenly reinterpreted in a light he had never bothered to examine. Assets brought into the marriage, pre-existing interests, beneficial ownership. His stomach tightened. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering, demanding reassurance. The lawyer didn't answer. He was reading. Slowly. Mara never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She let the facts do what emotion never could. She explained how certain investments Daniel bragged about at dinners were never truly his. How capital that saved his company during a critical year had come from a source he never questioned because it made him feel powerful. She explained how she had watched him accept praise for decisions he didn't understand, watched him mistake luck for brilliance. The courtroom listened. The cameras rolled. Then she explained the night he threw her out. Not with tears, with timestamps, phone records, security logs. She described the freezing rain not as cruelty but as context, a detail that mattered because it demonstrated intent. Daniel shifted in his seat. The judge watched him carefully. This was no longer about a marriage. It was about character. Daniel's lawyer objected again. "Weaketh. Is time overruled?" Mara continued. She described how accounts had been frozen, how access had been revoked without notice, how a pattern emerged when those actions were placed beside others. The judge asked for clarification. Mara provided it, calmly, precisely. The room felt smaller. Daniel felt trapped inside his own story. When Mara finished, she sat. No flourish, no declaration of victory, just patience. The judge called for a brief pause. This time Daniel didn't stand. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if refusing to move might undo what had already been said. Reporters whispered. Analysts typed. Somewhere in the building, phones rang with urgency. During the break, Daniel finally spoke to his lawyer in earnest. He asked what could be done. The lawyer said the words Daniel had never heard directed at him before. "We need to consider exposure." Daniel laughed sharply. Exposure was for weak men, for people who made mistakes. He had followed the rules. He had protected himself. The lawyer didn't argue. He simply asked again if Daniel had ever verified where the money came from. Court resumed for the final time that day. The judge addressed both parties. He spoke about transparency, about obligations, about the seriousness of misrepresentation. Then he looked directly at Daniel and asked a question that felt less like procedure and more like judgment. "Mr. Hale, did you know the source of the funds that stabilized your company 3 years ago?" Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He said what he always said, that it was handled by advisors, that he trusted the process. The judge nodded slowly, the way someone does when they already know the Swear. Mara stood once more. She didn't ask for vengeance. She didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for accuracy, for the record to reflect reality, for assumptions to be replaced with facts. When she said her real name again, it landed differently, not as a shock, but as confirmation. Daniel finally understood that the freezing moment wasn't the name itself, it was what the name represented. A network, a legacy, a reach that made his confidence feel childish. As the judge adjourned for the day, Daniel remained seated. His world had not ended yet, but it had tilted enough that balance felt impossible. Mara gathered her papers and left without looking back. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street where he thought she would disappear was dry, ordinary, indifferent, and for the first time since the night he locked her out, Daniel felt something close to fear. Not of loss, but of being seen clearly at last. By the time Daniel Hale reached his apartment that night, the illusion of control had completely unraveled. The penthouse felt cavernous, stripped of its triumph, every reflective surface returning an image he no longer recognized. He poured himself a drink and didn't taste it. His phone buzzed constantly, but not with congratulations or reassurance. It was his board, his investors, people who never called unless something was wrong. He ignored them at first, pacing, replaying the courtroom moment when Mara spoke her real name, and the room reacted before he did. That reaction haunted him more than her words. He slept poorly, waking to flashes of memory he had dismissed for years. How she never reacted when he bragged about numbers. How she never asked for gifts. How she all eyes listened when his advisors spoke, quietly attentive in ways he mistook for ignorance. He had built a narrative around her because it made him feel superior. That narrative was now collapsing under its own weight. By morning, the press had pivoted. Headlines softened, then sharpened again, but this time toward him. Analysts questioned the origins of the capital injection that saved his company. Anonymous sources wondered aloud whether Daniel Hale had exaggerated his role in its recovery. His assistant called to say 2 meetings had been cancelled without explanation. Another said a major partner wanted to pause. Discussions. Daniel felt the walls closing in, not with drama, but with procedure. The most dangerous kind. Mara, meanwhile, moved through her day without urgency. She met with people who had known her long before Daniel ever existed in her life. There were no raised voices, no gloating, only adjustments, plans shifting back into alignment. Her reappearance was not disruptive to them, it was corrective. She had never been gone, she had simply been silent. The next court session arrived sooner than Daniel expected. He entered with less swagger, flanked by the same team that now looked unsteady beside him. Mara arrived alone again. The judge addressed the room with formality, then invited Mara to continue her testimony. She did, not by revisiting the past, but by outlining the present. Ownership structures, voting rights, debt obligations. She spoke as someone accustomed to these rooms, these rules. Daniel's lawyer objected less frequently now. Each objection felt performative, destined to fail. When the question of intent arose, Daniel tried to reclaim the narrative. He testified that he never meant to harm her, that the divorce was businesslike, that freezing accounts was standard procedure. The judge listened, then asked why standard procedure required throwing someone onto the street at night. Daniel had no answer that didn't sound cruel. Silence filled the space again. Then came the moment Daniel would later replay endlessly. The introduction of correspondence, emails he had never read closely, documents he had signed because they came from people he trusted, people who told him he was brilliant. Mara presented them calmly. She explained how trust worked when built on knowledge instead of ego. She didn't accuse him of malice. She accused him of negligence. That word hit harder than any insult. The judge requested a recess. This time Daniel didn't pace. He sat, head in his hands, while his lawyer spoke quietly about exposure, about inquiries, about the possibility that this case would not end with divorce alone. Daniel asked if Mara was doing this out of revenge. The lawyer shook his head. "This isn't personal," he said. "That's the problem." When proceedings resumed, the judge delivered interim rulings that shifted the balance irrevocably. Asset freezes, temporary injunctions, oversight. Each decision was framed as precautionary, but Daniel felt the weight of them like judgment. His company's stock dipped within minutes. Notifications flashed across screens in the gallery. The market was listening. Mara listened too, but she didn't react. She had already accounted for this. Volatility was expected. Exposure always came with turbulence. What mattered was control, and control was returning to its rightful place. After court adjourned, Daniel attempted to speak to her. He called her name, the real one this time, tasting it like a foreign language. She stopped, turned, and looked at him fully for the first time since the rain. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, only distance. He began to apologize. She raised a hand gently, not to silence him, but to signal finality. "This isn't a conversation," she said. "It's a correction." Then she walked away. That night, Daniel watched as the life he had constructed on assumption began to unravel thread by thread. Accounts flagged, partners cautious, advisors suddenly careful with the "R" words. The systems he once commanded no longer responded with obedience. They responded with scrutiny. And somewhere beyond his reach, Mara was reclaiming something he had never realized he was holding hostage. He had thrown her onto the street believing she would vanish. Instead, she had stepped back into a world that had been waiting for her return. And Daniel Hale was learning, too late, that some names do not disappear. They wait. The weeks that followed were brutal in their quiet efficiency. Daniel Hale discovered that reputations did not collapse with explosions, but with emails that went unanswered and meetings that never quite materialized. The board requested clarifications. Auditors requested documents. Regulators requested time. Each request was polite. Each one cut deeper than the last. He began to understand that power was not loud. It was procedural, and he was losing it. Mara watched the unraveling from a distance that felt intentional. She did not appear on talk shows. She did not grant interviews. When reporters asked for statements, they received none. Silence was her message. In that silence, others spoke for her. Analysts pieced together histories. Journalists revisited old filings with new curiosity. Patterns emerged that Daniel could not explain away with charm or confidence. The narrative he had built was being replaced by one he could not control. The next court date arrived with less spectacle but greater consequence. The judge opened by acknowledging the shift in scope. What began as a divorce now carried implications far beyond two people. He spoke about fiduciary responsibility, about the obligations of those who command capital. Daniel listened. Ed, nodding mechanically, while his lawyer scribbled notes that looked increasingly frantic. Mara presented no theatrics. She presented clarity. She explained how certain shell entities linked to Daniel's company traced back to trusts that predated their marriage by decades. She explained how her decision to remain silent during the marriage was not weakness, but choice. She wanted to know who Daniel was when he believed no one important was watching. The room absorbed this without judgment. It did not need to judge. The facts were doing that work. Daniel testified again, this time less assured. His answers circled themselves, careful, defensive. He insisted he never asked where the money came from because it worked, because it saved the company, because success validated the means. When asked if he would have treated Mara differently had he known who she was, he hesitated. That hesitation echoed louder than any confession. The judge noted it. Outside the courtroom, the market reacted in real time. Shares dipped, rebounded, dipped again. Volatility became the story. Mara's representatives, previously unseen, began appearing quietly in financial districts Daniel had once dominated. Conversations shifted, alliances recalibrated. What Daniel had built was not being destroyed. It was being absorbed. The turning point came without fanfare. A regulatory filing surfaced, dry and unremarkable to most readers, devastating to those who understood it. Control had changed hands, not through force, through compliance. Daniel learned of it the same way everyone else did, through a notification he could not dismiss. He called his lawyer. The lawyer did not answer. He called his advisor. The call went to voicemail. He finally called his assistant, who spoke carefully, as if reading from a script. "There's been a transition," she said. Daniel laughed weakly. Transitions were for mergers, for expansions, not for men like him. He hung up and stared at the city he once believed bent around his will. Mara returned to court one final time, not to gloat, to conclude. The judge reviewed the findings, acknowledged the transfer of control, and addressed Daniel directly. He spoke about responsibility, about the cost of assumption, about the danger of confusing access with ownership. When he ruled, it was precise, limited, final. Daniel sat motionless. There was no dramatic outburst, no protest. The room did not need it. Everyone present understood what had occurred. A correction had been made. Mara stood, thanked the court, and turned to leave. As she did, the judge called her name. Her real name. He thanked her for her professionalism, for her restraint. She nodded once, then walked out. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Indifferent to fallen men, indifferent to restored legacies. Mara stepped onto the street, not as someone cast out, but as someone returned to herself. The rain did not fall this time. The pavement was dry, ordinary. She paused for a moment, breathing in the city she had survived, then continued forward, leaving behind a man who had mistaken possession for power and learned too late the difference. Daniel Hale's removal was announced internally first, in language so neutral it bordered on merciful. The memo spoke of restructuring, of alignment, of future vision. It did not mention failure. It did not mention the woman whose quiet return had dismantled him piece by piece. But everyone knew. In executive circles, knowledge travels faster than explanation. By the time the press caught up, Daniel was already irrelevant. He packed his office alone. Security stood outside, polite but immovable. The same building he once entered without pause now required authorization he no longer possessed. He tried to joke with one of the guards, a man who had nodded respectfully at him for years. The guard smiled faintly and said nothing. That silence was the final confirmation. Daniel carried a box to his car and realized he had nowhere to take it that felt like home. Mara did not attend the board meeting that finalized the transition. She did not need to. The outcome had been inevitable long before the vote. Her absence was intentional. She understood symbolism better than spectacle. Letting others formalize what she had already secured reinforced the truth that this was not a takeover born of ego, but a correction rooted in structure. Her days took on a rhythm that felt unfamiliar at first, not because of luxury, but because of autonomy. She chose where to be, who to see, what mattered. There were meetings, of course, but they were purposeful. Conversations focused on long-term stability, on repair rather than conquest. She listened more than she spoke. People noticed. Power that listens unsettles those accustomed to noise. Daniel attempted outreach through intermediaries, old friends, mutual contacts, people who once benefited from his generosity and now measured their words carefully. Each message carried a variation of the same request. A meeting, a conversation, a chance to explain. None reached Mara. She had given instructions that were followed without question. Silence was not cruelty. It was boundary. When the criminal inquiry became public, Daniel's name trended briefly. Commentators debated intent. Some defended him as careless rather than malicious. Others dissected his statements with forensic enthusiasm. Daniel did not participate. His lawyers advised against it. They spoke on his behalf, carefully, sparingly. The man who once thrived on attention now avoided it. The spotlight he craved had turned unforgiving. Mara read the coverage only once, not out of interest, but out of necessity. She wanted to understand the narrative forming around her absence. It was surprisingly restrained. Analysts focused on process, not personality, on precedent, not drama. This pleased her. The less mythologized she became, the more effective she could be. A week after the final ruling, she visited the building where Daniel had thrown her out. Not the penthouse, the lobby. She stood near the entrance, watching people pass through doors that opened automatically for them. No one recognized her. That anonymity felt like closure. She did not need acknowledgement from strangers. She had reclaimed something more fundamental. She thought briefly of the night in the rain, not with anger, but with distance. That version of herself felt like a relative she had loved and outgrown, necessary, gone. She left the building without looking back, stepping into a life that no longer required proof. Daniel, meanwhile, downsized with reluctance. The penthouse sold quickly. The car followed. His world shrank in increments he could measure but not control. Friends stopped inviting him places, not out of spite, out of discomfort. He reminded them of fragility, of how quickly status could evaporate. People avoid mirrors that reflect truths they don't want to see. One afternoon, Daniel sat alone in a small apartment, scrolling through old photos. He paused on one of Mara, laughing at something just out of frame. He realized he couldn't remember what had made her laugh. That omission hurt more than the loss of money, more than the public embarrassment. He had never known her, not really, and by the time he wanted to, it no longer mattered. Mara received an invitation weeks later, a foundation gala. Her name appeared among donors, not honorees. She attended briefly, spoke politely, left early. As she exited, someone thanked her for changing the way they thought about power. She smiled and said nothing. Change did not need applause. The city continued, markets adjusted, stories faded, but beneath the surface, a recalibration had occurred. Quiet, permanent. Mara had not sought revenge, she had restored balance, and in doing so she had demonstrated something far more unsettling than domination. She had shown what happens when someone you underestimate refuses to disappear. Time passed in a way that felt different for Mara, slower but fuller, as though each day carried weight instead of noise. The urgency that once defined her life had dissolved. Decisions were no longer reactions, they were intentions. She found herself waking without dread, without the need to check messages or anticipate conflict. The silence around her was not emptiness, it was space reclaimed. Her influence, however, continued to ripple outward. Projects once stalled by indecision moved forward with surprising momentum. Odds that had been paralyzed by ego found clarity under quieter leadership. Mara rarely appeared in public, but her presence was felt in policy shifts, in funding decisions that favored sustainability over spectacle. Those who worked with her began to notice a pattern. She asked questions no one else asked, not to assert dominance, but to expose assumptions, the same kind that had undone Daniel. Daniel watched these changes from a distance he could not cross. His days were consumed by logistics he once outsourced. Bills, schedules, limitations. The criminal investigation moved slowly, methodically, its pace dictated by procedure rather than emotion. He lived in a state of suspended consequence, not yet sentenced but already diminished. Friends advised patience. He mistook it for hope. One evening, Daniel received a letter, not from a lawyer, not from a creditor, from Mara. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. He opened it with trembling hands, expecting condemnation or pity. What he found was neither. The letter was brief. It acknowledged the past without relitigating it. It stated facts, it clarified boundaries. It wished him resolution. Nothing more, nothing less. Daniel read it 3 times, each time realizing that the absence of hatred was the harshest verdict he would ever receive. Mara did not send the letter to absolve him. She sent it to release herself. Closure did not require confrontation. It required clarity. She had learned that power, when properly understood, did not need to linger in old wounds. As the year turned, attention shifted elsewhere. New scandals, new heroes. The public appetite moved on. Mara preferred it that way. She invested me in places that did not track headlines, in mentoring, in rebuilding institutions quietly damaged by the same arrogance that had once ruled her marriage. Her work did not trend, it endured. Daniel's case eventually concluded without spectacle. Settlements were reached, penalties assessed. His name faded from relevance, resurfacing only in footnotes and cautionary examples. He returned the letter to its envelope and placed it in a drawer he rarely opened. It was the only thing he kept from that chapter of his life. On the anniversary of the night she was thrown to the street, Mara walked alone through the city, not in reflection but in recognition. She passed the bus shelter where she had once sat shivering. It looked smaller now, ordinary. She smiled faintly and continued on, her footsteps steady, her future unburdened. Somewhere behind her, a story ended. Ahead, something quieter and far more powerful continued. Not a legend, not a warning, a correction complete. Mara's life after the trial settled into a pattern that no one could have predicted because it lacked spectacle. There were no victory interviews, no memoir teasers, no calculated reinventions. She did not become a symbol in the way people expected. She became something far more unsettling to those who watched from a distance, consistent, predictable in her integrity, unavailable to manipulation. Institutions adjusted around her presence the way ecosystems adjust after a long absent force returns. Meetings ran shorter, agendas tightened, decisions that once stalled under personalities moved forward under principles. People stopped performing for approval and started preparing. They learned quickly that charm held no currency with her, only clarity. She listened without reacting, then responded with questions that cut directly to the fault lines others preferred to ignore. Those questions changed trajectories. Funding shifted away from vanity projects and toward infrastructure. Partnerships dissolved not because of scandal, but because they no longer aligned with reality. Quiet exits replaced dramatic firings. Those who adapted thrived. Those who relied on noise faded without announcement. The world did not applaud. It recalibrated. Daniel attempted once more to insert himself into relevance. He wrote an opinion piece that no major outlet accepted. He pitched a consultancy that attracted curiosity but no trust. People met with him politely and declined carefully. He was not hated. He was discounted. For a man who had lived on validation, irrelevance proved more punishing than judgment. Mara never followed these attempts. Not out of indifference, but because she understood something Daniel never had. Attention is an investment. She did not spend it on the past. Her focus turned instead toward legacy, not in the sense of name preservation, but in impact continuity. She asked herself what systems could outlive her presence, what structures could remain ethical without supervision. These were harder questions than revenge had ever been. One afternoon, she visited a school funded quietly through one of her trusts. The students did not know her name. They did not need to. They benefited from resources designed to remove obstacles, not impose gratitude. She spoke briefly, answered questions honestly, left without ceremony. Power that demanded recognition had always seemed fragile to her. Power that operated invisibly endured. At night, alone, she sometimes thought of the woman she had been before the rain, not with longing, with respect. That woman had survived without knowing what she carried. She had endured humiliation without losing curiosity. She had loved without armor. Those traits, Mara realized, had not been weaknesses. They were training. The city continued to produce stories louder than hers. That was fine. Noise burned fast. Influence accumulated slowly. Years from now, few would remember Daniel Hale by name. Fewer still would recall the night a woman was thrown into the street. But systems would bear the mark of the correction that followed. Policies adjusted. Cultures recalibrated. Assumptions challenged. Mara walked through her life without the need to announce herself. Those who knew, knew. Those who didn't matter. The court had frozen when her real name was spoken, not because of the syllables, but because of the history behind them. History, she understood, was not inherited. It was upheld. On a quiet evening, she stood at her window, watching the city lights scatter like constellations. Somewhere below, people hurried home, believing their lives invisible, their choices insignificant. She smiled at the thought. Power, she had learned, did not always roar. Sometimes it waited. Times, it walked calmly back into the world after being underestimated. And sometimes, it changed everything without ever asking to be seen. The final transformation in Mara's life was not one the world could easily observe, because it happened internally, in places cameras never reached. It was the shift from survival to authorship, from reacting to shaping. She no longer measured time by crises resolved, or threats neutralized. She measured it by alignment, by how closely her days matched her values. That metric never trended, but it never failed her either. She declined many opportunities that would have expanded her visibility. Advisory boards, keynote speeches, profiles framed as inspiration. Each offer came wrapped in admiration and expectation. Each one asked, implicitly, for a version of her story polished into myth. She refused them gently. Myths simplified. She preferred accuracy. Her story was not about revenge or destiny. It was about clarity arriving too late for one man and just in time for her. Daniel Hale's name surfaced one last time in her awareness through an annual report she skimmed for context. A single line referenced a prior administration's errors and the corrective measures implemented afterward. His legacy reduced to a lesson embedded in process. She paused on the line, not with satisfaction but with closure. This was the appropriate scale. Not drama, documentation. That night, Mara hosted a small dinner. No speeches, no announcements, just conversation. The people around the table represented different sectors, different histories, different beliefs. What unified them was not loyalty to her, but commitment to work that mattered. They debated ideas, challenged assumptions, laughed without performing. At one point, someone asked her how it felt to be underestimated and then proven right. She considered the question carefully before answering. It felt instructive, she said. Being underestimated teaches you who is watching and who is merely looking. It reveals who listens and who waits for confirmation. It clarifies where power actually lives. The table fell quiet, not in awe but in understanding. They recognized the truth in it. Many had lived it themselves in smaller ways. Later, alone, Mara walked through rooms that reflected neither excess nor austerity. They reflected choice. Objects remained because they served purpose or carried meaning. Everything else had been released. She understood now that accumulation was often a substitute for certainty. She no longer needed substitutes. Outside, the city breathed. Somewhere, someone was being underestimated at that very moment. Someone was being dismissed as irrelevant, inexperienced, replaceable. Mara hoped, quietly, that they would survive the dismissal long enough to understand what it revealed. She hoped they would learn sooner than she had that silence is not absence and patience is not surrender. The night she had been thrown onto the street no longer defined her, but it remained significant, not as trauma, as a threshold. It marked the point where her life divided into before and after. Before, she had adapted herself to fit expectations. After, she allowed expectations to break against reality. That shift had changed everything. In the end, the court freezing had not been about shock. It had been about recognition, a system designed to reward Idents had been confronted with substance. A narrative built on assumption had been corrected by fact. That correction echoed outward, subtle but irreversible. Mara turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, unburdened by the need to rehearse tomorrow. Whatever came, she would meet it as herself, fully scaled, fully present. Somewhere far behind her, a man who mistook ownership for power would continue to live with the consequences of that confusion. Somewhere ahead, a future shaped by quieter decisions waited. She rested knowing one final truth, the one that outlasted every headline and every courtroom gasp. You do not need to announce your worth. The moment someone tries to discard you is often the moment they reveal how little they understand what you carry. And when the world finally freezes in recognition, it is not because you changed. It is because you stopped hiding.